Today we will learn and reflect on what it was like to be a Spartan woman and family life in Sparta. What was it like to be a woman immersed in the military culture of Sparta? What was it like to raise children in Sparta? Why do we want to study what it was like to be a Spartan woman? Because in the future we will be reflecting on Plato's Republic. In his Utopia, Plato describes some rather odd marital practices controlled by the state that may be similar to Spartan practices. Was Plato's Republic actually a reflection on whether the Spartan social mores were superior to the Athenian social mores? After all, Sparta did win the Peloponnesian Wars. Was Spartan culture seen as superior by some in Athens? We have already reflected on the life of a Spartan warrior, and if you were not a warrior, you were a slave, for Spartans were not permitted to be merchants. Being a woman in any ancient warrior culture was a challenge, as depicted in the Homer classic, the Iliad, where the basic plotline was two warriors, Achilles and King Agamemnon, who bickered over a concubine captured in raids in the Trojan Wars. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in our PowerPoint script posted to SlideShare. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Although all Greek city-states were defended by citizen hoplite forces, Sparta was unique in that her army was a permanent army, where all male citizens lived in military barracks from the age of 7 until they were 30 years old, constantly honing their military skills. And we discussed what it was like to fight like a hoplite in our Histories of Herodotus video. Our major source is Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, the lawgiver of Sparta. Unlike Solon, the lawgiver of Athens, who is definitely a real person, most historians agree that Lycurgus was likely a legendary founder figure like Romulus and Remus of Rome, and that his life and accomplishments were a composite of many Spartans, perhaps over several generations. Interestingly, the historian Will Durant states that the ideal for marriage for a man in Sparta was 30, while a woman was expected to be married by 20. But this differs from most other sources that state that Spartan men marry at 20 and live with their wives and families at 30. We must remember that the Spartans left us no works of literature. Everything we know about the Spartans are memorialized by Athenian or other Greek and Roman authors. We can only know what these ancient sources tell us, supplanted by archaeology, inscriptions, and coins, and these customs may have developed over time. So our knowledge of ancient times will always be incomplete. So now let's get into our discussion on Spartan women, marriage, and family life. Plutarch said that Lycurgus prescribed a tough regime of physical exercise for unmarried women, involving running, wrestling, discus, and javelin. So when the time came for embryos to take root in their wombs, they would gain a healthy start in healthy bodies and develop well, while the women themselves would have the strength to endure childbirth and would cope well and easily with the trials of labor. Lycurgus removed their physical frailty, stopped them from spending all their time indoors, and in general got rid of their femininity. He made girls just as used to boys to parading naked, and to dancing and singing in festivals, with young men as spectators. They were even encouraged to taunt young men. Now, the ancient world was a different world. Their medical knowledge and cures were primitive. For example, I had appendicitis as a teenager. I would have died if I had lived in the ancient world. In the ancient world, parents often did not name their children until they were a few weeks old due to the high infant mortality rate. Only half of the children survived to adulthood. Some scholars estimate that only 1 in 10 people survive to a ripe old age. Definitely the Spartan emphasis on physical fitness for girls better prepared them for the rigors of childbirth, although we can only speculate on the degree. Plutarch's Lycurgus explains, "There was nothing shameful in the young women's nakedness, never a trace of lewdness, but only modesty." Okay. On the contrary, nudity accustomed them to simplicity and made them admire physical fitness. And Plutarch says this was also done to encourage marriage. And Plutarch's Lycurgus tells us about the crazy marriage customs of the Spartans, which reflected their extreme warrior culture. The marriage ceremony involved this forceful abduction of the woman, who would not be a child, too young for marriage, but a woman in her prime, ripe and ready for it. The abducted woman was then handed over to the so-called bridesmaid, who would cut her hair very short, dress her in men's clothes and shoes, and leave her lying alone on a straw mattress without any light to see by. This may have upset the uptight British historians a century ago. The English historian Will Durant prefaces this account by Plutarch by stating that their parents arranged the marriage before this staged abduction. And he adds that the woman is expected to resist so she could truly be seized like she was a Homeric concubine. And the footnote says that the source is both Plutarch and another Englishman for this. Now this would not upset ancient audiences nearly as much. Abduction was seen by some as an acceptable method of courtship. And we should also remember that the Trojan Wars themselves were started when Prince Paris of Troy kidnapped Helen of Sparta from her husband Menelaus. And several church councils also reminded Christians that abduction was not an acceptable form of courtship. And the last church council to proclaim this was the Council of Trent. Seizing women for marriage was part of many ancient cultures. When in war a particularly hated city-state was conquered, it was common practice to slaughter the military-aged men and enslave the women and children, and many of the women would be enslaved as concubines. Early in the Peloponnesian Wars, Thucydides tells us a dramatic story of how first the Athenian assembly condemned the city-state of Mytilene to this fate, then they changed their mind the next day, and how a furiously rode trireme bearing this good news beat the previous day's trireme that was lingering just in the nick of time, saving the city of Mytilene. And Thucydides also tells us about the siege of the Melians, whose men were executed and their women and children sold into slavery at the hands of the Athenians late in the war, and how the Athenians worried that they would suffer the same fate when they lost the war to Sparta. Although the Trojan War legends assure us that Queen Andromache of Troy retained her honor when she was enslaved, that is her depicted in the slave market on our YouTube thumbnail. Another example of a massive abduction of women is the rape of the Sabine women, which was a founding Roman myth where the ancient Romans abducted the women for wives from a neighboring tribe, and also in the ending chapters of the Book of Judges. The men from the depleted tribe of Benjamin were permitted to mass abduct their wives. But then Will Durant says something surprising, that if some adults of marrying age were unmarried, some men might be placed in a dark room with an equal number of girls and be left to pick their life mates in the darkness. And the Spartans thought that such choosing would not be blinder than love. The source he footnotes for this is not Plutarch, but another historian named Athenaeus, and he was a 3rd century Roman historian in Egypt 2 centuries after Plutarch. What were his sources for this? Whether this was an actual practice or just stories spun over 5 centuries is impossible to say. But we know for certain that the thought of a lusty young man competing and grabbing for his bride in a dark room is certainly entertaining. Plutarch's Lycurgus does not want us to forget about the groom on his wedding night, who was not drunk, because Spartan men never get drunk, but was sober as usual, having first dined in his Fidicium, which is the military mess hall, and then slipped into the room, undid the woman's belt, picked her up, and carried her over to the bed. He spent only a short time with her before leaving quietly, before returning to his barracks. This is what honeymoons in Sparta were like. Spartan boys in their military training camps are never fed enough to thrive, so they must develop the stealth needed to steal the food to be healthy. And this need for stealth continues into their married life, except that they needed to be stealthy to visit their wives, rather than to cheat on them. Plutarch's Lycurgus states that afterwards the young husband would visit his wife secretly, taking every precaution out of embarrassment and fear of being seen by anyone in the house. Meanwhile, his wife would be devising plans for them to meet without anyone else knowing about it. Quite often there would be children born before the men saw their own wives by the light of day. How crazy is this? Did this help or hurt the Spartan demographics? Plutarch's Lycurgus opines that it helped increase the number of Spartan warriors, because when the Spartan couples came together for sex, they were physically fertile and ready for love, rather than being sated and added from unrestricted sexual intercourse, so that every time they parted, a feeling remained in each of them which would act as a stimulus for desire and affection. Now, modern and most other scholars disagree with Plutarch on this point. The Spartan lifestyle encouraged rampant homosexuality and pederasty, and perhaps more than a few men just didn't want to be bothered sneaking around just to spend time with their wives. Modern historians are unanimous that Sparta always had problems replenishing their warriors, and the earthquake that struck and wiped out one entire military class when the barracks collapsed during the Peloponnesian Wars certainly did not help. Now, marriage in Sparta was not a private affair, and the state was very interested in her women bearing many warriors. And you might ask, with all the separation and sneaking around, was adultery a problem? And the answer is no. Adultery was not only not a problem in Sparta, it was almost impossible. because in Plutarch's words, Lycurgus banished the vain, womanish feeling of jealousy. Spartan men were permitted to share their wives. Plutarch's Lycurgus imagines, suppose an older Spartan man with a young wife liked and approved of a young man of nobility and virtue. He could introduce him to her, and then once the younger man impregnated his wife with his noble seed, he could adopt the son as his own. Just like breeding a horse, I suppose, with the same concern with bloodlines. And Lycurgus continues. Suppose a man of high principles, get this, the man of high principles, admired a woman who is married to someone else for her modesty and fine children. He could prevail upon her husband to let him sleep with her, so that he could sow his seed in rich and fertile soil, and produce excellent children who would be blood brothers of others just as fine. Then Plutarch says that Lycurgus says that the laws of the other Greek city-states regarding love and marriage are stupid and hypocritical. Because while people arrange for their bitches and mares to be mounted by the best male dogs and horses of their neighbors, they keep their wives under lock and key, claiming that they and they alone had the right to have children by them, whether they, the husbands, were idiots or dotards or invalids. So, in Sparta, is adultery impossible, or is it simply legalized? What was it like to raise small children in Sparta? Now, the Spartan state was intimately interested in the raising of future Spartan warriors. After a child was born, it was not up to the father whether the child was to be brought up. Instead, the child was taken to an assembly of the eldest men of his tribe. They then examined the baby, and if it was sturdy and strong, they told the father to bring it up, and assigned it one of the 9,000 plots of land, which were worked by helot slaves. And if it was flawed or deformed, the infant was sent to the place called the apotheteia, the place of exposure, a rugged spot near Mount Taygetus, since death was preferable for both the child and the state if the child was weak and sickly. Spartan nurses were also tough. Helicopter moms were forbidden in Sparta. Plutarch tells us that the nurses trained the babies to use their limbs and bodies freely by dispensing with swaddling clothes, and also not to be fussy and fastidious about their food, not to be scared of the dark or frightened of being left alone, and never to demean themselves with tantrums or tears. How were these Spartan nurses able to do that? Well, anyway, Plutarch tells us that many people sought out Spartan nurses to bring up their children tough. Like in nearly all societies, young girls and boys played together until the boys started their military training at age 7 or so. Not much is said about how girls are raised at home. Dr. Wikipedia, referencing a modern historian in the footnote, states that Spartan girls were taught music, dancing, singing, and poetry, and could participate in certain religious cults. Was there any education for girls outside the home in Sparta? Who knows? Probably not. Spartan housewives were far more independent than Athenian and most other Greek women because their husbands mostly lived in the barracks. That meant the women ran the household, and since adultery was less of a problem due to lax community norms, women were seen in public, unlike the cloistered Athenian wives. Raising young Spartan children was also a community affair. They were also raised by neighbors, who were free to discipline them. Pseudo-Xenophon tells us that should any boy tell his father that he has been beaten by another, then it is a disgrace if the father does not give his son a further beating. A Spartan father would trust that another Spartan would not give their children any dishonorable order. And now the most amusing part of the video, sayings of Spartan women. Spartan women are raised to encourage their boys to behave like men and raise their boys to be future warriors. Plutarch collected Spartan sayings by both men and women. Enjoy our favorites. The Spartan woman, as she was handing her son his shield and giving him some encouragement, said, "Son, either with this or on this." And she was telling her son that he should either return carrying his shield, which means that he did not break in fear and run from the battle, dropping his heavy shield, or that he should be carried home dead on his own shield. When a foreigner once said, "You Laconian women are the only ones who control your men," she received a Laconian reply. "That's because we're the only ones who give birth to men." A nation of Brunhildes they are. Hearing that her son had died in battle, one Spartan mother responded, wouldn't it be inevitable that when he fought the enemy, either he would be killed by them or he would kill them? To hear that he died in a fashion worthy of me and the city and his ancestors is pleasanter than if he were immortal but a coward. Another Spartan woman killed her son who had deserted as unworthy of his country, saying, "He is not my offspring." The following sayings demonstrate that the capture and sale of women as slaves was common in the ancient world, and that women made the best of a bad situation. Once a Spartan woman who was up for sale was asked what skill she possessed, and she said to be trustworthy. Another woman who had been taken prisoner and was asked the same question said, to manage a household well. When a woman was asked by somebody whether she would be good if he were to buy her, she said, yes, and even if you don't buy me. Another woman was asked by the auctioneer what skills she had. She said, to be free. When the man who bought her ordered her to perform services unfitting for a free woman, she declared, you'll be sorry that you didn't refuse to make a purchase like this, and then committed suicide. We think we have problems. Just imagine what it was like to be a woman living in the ancient world. She didn't worry so much about retirement. She worried about whether a possible future would come when some foreign army would swoop in, kill her husband, either in battle or afterwards, and enslave her and her children, and the possibility that she and her daughters would be the concubine of an enemy soldier. Now we'll discuss the sources we use for this video. Since all our videos on the Peloponnesian Wars use many of the same sources, we have a video and book reviews of ancient Greek history. In addition, after we made that video, we picked up this Penguin collection of writings, Plutarch on Sparta. It includes an amusing collection of Spartan sayings and Spartan women's sayings, and a short essay on Sparta by an author I'm calling Pseudo-Xenophon, because most scholars do not believe he's the true Xenophon, although he appears to be copying his style. After reading it, it does make sense to me, although I did not read the original Greek. And also, he has some biographies of the Spartan generals in a good translation, not the Dryden translation, which I absolutely despise. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.